to get to Marianne. So tonight's program is If You Can't Beat Them, Eat Them with Marianne Krasny, who I will note that I have known for now more than 20 years, which kind of blows my mind. I met her way back when I was teaching in the now defunct education department at Cornell University, and that's also when I met Rob Ross at PRI and eventually ended up working for PRI. But I'm going to go ahead without further ado and hand it off to Marianne. So take it away, Marianne.
Well, thank you, Don, and thanks for Rob and Ingrid for inviting me. And it's really great to be here tonight and to see some people I've known maybe even longer than I've known you, Don, like Karen Holweg from Boulder, Colorado, who's on the call. So welcome, everybody. And I'm going to share my screen and get started. All right. So I'm on the faculty in the Department of Natural Resources. Oops, sorry, I need to do this again. Let's try this again, sorry. Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at Cornell University, and I'm also director of the Civic Ecology Lab. And part of what I'll be talking about today is drawn from my recent book, In This Together, Connecting with Your Community to Combat the Climate Crisis. I should mention that the book is published by Cornell University Press, but it's not an academic book. It's actually what they call a trade book. So, which means it's supposed to be for a popular audience. So this was a new adventure for me, writing a trade book, less academic. All right. So maybe in the chat, and I'm not going to have the chat up done, so maybe you can just help me here, but let's go through some of these climate actions and see which ones are the most, what you think are the most effective. So, you know, you can write in the chat, or if you think EV might be most effective climate behavior in reducing emissions, or maybe getting a heat pump at your house. I'm going from right to left across the top. Don, can you see, I know you're muted, but can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Okay, so great. So plant-rich diet, down here, reducing food waste, women's health and education, or solar panels. Let me know if anybody writes anything in the chat.
I will. Nothing
Okay.
yet. Plant-rich diet is the first response. Reducing food waste is the second.
Okay.
Plant-rich diet is the third. Women's health and education.
What's okay, great. So it sounds from what Don's telling me that you all have written, it sounds like you have all been looking at the Project Drawdown website, yes. Which has reduced food waste and plant-rich diets is number 2, and family planning is number 3. Obviously, there's going to be some disagreement. It depends on the way you figure this out. There's a lot of assumptions, but we know at least that reducing food waste and plant-rich diets are important. And so that is why I talked about if you can't beat them, eat them. In other words, food is a possible way to talk about climate without maybe even talking about climate. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk just very briefly about the science of food emissions. I have a lot of graphics, and I hope it's more to give you ideas about ways you might teach about this. No, real instructions, but just there's a lot of different sort of visuals that one can use to teach about food emissions. And I will also offer some solutions to food emissions through legislation, new technologies, and school programs. And then we'll have a little break, and I'll talk more about some issues that I discuss in my book, spreading individual behaviors, and finally, network climate action. If you, I'm just admitting Jane Heidenspry. I don't even know if I'm allowed to, but it came up, so hi, Jane. I've also known Jane for a long time. And please put questions in the chat at any time. Don might interrupt me if the questions are timely. So I hope to have more of a discussion rather than just a presentation. Okay, so reducing food waste. Since you all have already been looking at The drawdown, you probably know that food waste is a huge source of methane. That's why it's so important to reduce it. Nearly 20% of US methane emissions are from food waste. Food waste is the third most important methane emissions in the US after livestock and gas production. Okay, so if you look at the arrows, this is a complicated graphic, but there are some things I wanted to emphasize here. So 20% of the amount of consumer food waste is attributed to confusion over date labeling. And I'll talk about date labeling in a minute. So these are things like best by this date. 8% of global greenhouse emissions due to food waste. And then towards the bottom here, in the US, we waste about 40% of the food that is produced. So date labels, understanding date labels. In the US, the only date labels that are actually standardized by the federal government are those that have to do with baby food. So if you read expires on, sell by, use by, best if used by, over here in the yellow writing on the left, they don't necessarily mean anything. A lot of people look at them and they think, oh, I need to throw out my food because it's Best By and I didn't use it by that date. But you can smell your food or, give it a quick taste, look at it, see if there's any mold. Likely, it's still good. I have roommates, several people living with me, and they really look at these Best By things all the time and just throw out their food. So, hopefully there'll be some legislation. There was in the 2021-22 session of Congress a Food Date Labeling Act. A lot of people are advocating for food date labeling to be included in the Farm Bill or just a food waste office, a new food waste office across some agencies. But in any case, date label legislation has the potential to reduce a lot of food waste. And I wanted to mention, I'll be showing a few cartoons throughout. I was really lucky when I wrote this book to work with Emily Hoskins, who used to work for the New Yorker as a cartoonist, and she did a bunch of cartoons for me. So here's one in our food waste chapter, and it's an archaeologist working in Egypt, and it says Best By 47 BC, but it smells fine. Okay. So if we're thinking of food waste solutions in schools or anywhere else, we have this hierarchy from the EPA. The most important thing is obviously reduce the source of food waste. But, we often go to composting, but composting is pretty far down. We should be thinking about feeding hungry people, then feeding animals, industrial uses, such as converting it into something else like fuel, and then composting, and then landfills, according to the EPA. And this is also used by ReFed. I don't know if you're familiar with them, RE, and then capital FED.org, which is a food waste nonprofit that has tons of great resources on its site. Okay, so if you were at schools, sorry about that. So, you could think about food donation. Food donation is really, really tricky because there's so many rules about it. We have a great food donation organization in Ithaca, Food Donation Network. They pick up food from Wegmans and other places, and then they bring it to their warehouse where it's picked up by other people who take it to local donation programs. The thing about food waste is I've tried to work on food waste donation at Cornell. There's some people working on it, but it's so hard, like even from fraternities, if something's been a tray has been partially used, you really can't donate it. But you can think of in schools, for example, if it's something like bananas or a carton of milk or something that's prepackaged, then you could definitely have a food waste donation program or food donation program like this one here in the Oakland School District. Composting is also a solution, maybe not the top solution, but something that can be done. I noted that New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling provides grants for school food composting programs. Maine had a similar program. So, you can search and see what support is available in your area. And then this is a science enrichment booklet that Nancy Troutman and I wrote, again, many years ago, Composting in the Classroom. But you can search for it and download it free as a PDF if you're interested. But there's lots of composting education resources online. Okay, so now, oh my goodness, I'm having problems here. I wanted to switch to plant-rich diet. Another one of our cartoons about fox and the rabbits in it's called the Eat chapter. So why is plant-rich diet so important? Well, it's because of methane emissions from ruminants or cows. So you probably know that methane is about 84 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Ruminants globally are responsible for nearly a third of our methane emissions. And then cattle is the main source, but buffalo and goats and sheep are also an issue with methane emissions. So again, if you wanted to think about the science of this, microbes in the cow's stomach break down cattle feed into usable sources of energy and protein. And about 90% of the methane emitted by cows comes out through the mouth in burps, and about 5% through the other end. And then also, of course, the manure ponds emit methane and nitrous oxide. Okay. So carbon footprint of different foods, beef is way up there. Cheese is quite a bit lower, but still really high. And then pork and poultry are so much lower. And then eggs and milk. It's interesting because a lot of people complain about milk, but at least, these people figure it a different way. But cheese and I think butter are really much larger emitters because it takes so much milk to produce cheese or butter or some of these other dairy products, including yogurt. And then rice comes out a little high here because amongst all the plant-based foods, it's often grown in wet cultivation, which produces methane. And so there's a lot of efforts trying to figure out more dry production or different times of flooding the fields that won't produce as much methane. And this is a really interesting graphic because it breaks down within these emissions, where are they coming from? So let's just go to beef here. And you can see that it's green, right? So what would you say? Maybe about a fourth of the emissions from beef have to do with land use change. So whenever you cut down a forest to produce beef, then the carbon that is stored in the trees, the vegetation, the soils, most of it's going to be emitted. But the large proportion of beef emissions is from the farm. So that would be from the methane, largely from the belches, and then so on. And one interesting thing, if we go down here to chocolate, it can be a little shocking to those who love chocolate that it is actually a fairly high emitter. And this is because you can see it's mostly because of land use change. So if we can produce chocolate without converting forest into cow plantations, then we're going to reduce those emissions. And way down here at the bottom is nuts. So it's a tree crop, right? So its net emissions are actually zero because it's sequestering carbon. All right. But just because these different ruminant foods, mostly beef, lamb, goat, are producing so many emissions, doesn't mean we all have to eat houseplants or even that we all have to become vegan. Okay, so there's many different diets that are going to reduce our carbon emissions. Vegan is going to reduce our emissions the most, but there's lots of other alternatives: vegetarian, flexitarian, pescatarian, somebody who eats fish but not other meats, climate carnivore, who might not eat dairy but might eat poultry and pork because they're producing fewer emissions than cheese, for example, and then the Mediterranean diet. Okay, so then thinking about solutions, there are efforts in a number of states and cities to serve plant-based meals in schools. So California, this was from about 10 months ago, California adopted a one-time fund of 100 million to help districts provide plant-based or restricted diet meals. And then New York City is committed to the health and welfare of every well-being. And New York City, I think it has now Fridays, I think they're actually vegan. And then Mondays, I think meat-free. But they're trying, our mayor of New York City is, what is his name? Eric Adams. He's vegan or mostly vegan, as we know. And so he's trying to make some changes in the school system and I think also hospital procurement to try and have more plant-based options. All right. So what are some other solutions to carbon emissions from the beef and dairy industry? Selective breeding. So breeding cows that burp less basically can reduce us 15%. Vaccinations against the bacteria that are producing methane, reduce emissions by 5 to 20%. But the one that seems to be most effective here are feed additives. So there's a lot of experimentation going around with red algae and other feed additives to reduce those methane emissions. And here's just an example. If you can imagine this cow is breathing in this chamber, and there's all these tubes hooked up to the chamber, and they're trying to feed it different things and see what it does in terms of the methane that it's burping out. Okay, so another technology that's being used to try and lower emissions is alt proteins. And there are 3 types: plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation. It seems to me that these provide a really nice opportunity for learning science that's, I think, probably accessible to a lot of you science teachers, a little beyond me. But just as an example, here's plant-based meats, which would be like those old, remember the old bean burgers that were so dry? That would be a plant-based meat, as well as some of these things like Impossible Burger and so forth. So I'm not going to go through all this. I don't think that's the point, but the point is that you could access different infographics like this and use them to teach about the different technologies that are being used to produce plant-based meats. Same thing for cultivated meats, which is where they provide in these like cell tissue, and they get some scaffolding materials from the animals, and then the cells, as it says here, are stimulated or exercised to increase protein, and it produces something that is looks like, tastes like, has the texture of meat. I don't think any of this is available in the US now, but there's other countries that are way ahead of us on these technologies, including Singapore, where I think it's now available. You could buy cultivated meat. And then fermentation is the third technology. So there's 3 types. So we're all familiar with fermentation, right? Beer, wine, yogurt, cheese made through fermentation. But what they're talking about with these alt proteins is biomass fermentation, which uses microorganisms to produce protein. And a lot of times they use some sort of process where they're fermenting mushrooms or fungi as the primary ingredient for the meat product or meat-like product. And then there's even newer is precision fermentation, which is this over here. At the end, it's basically manipulating the DNA of bacteria, and they can then exactly reproduce certain food items. So some people think that this is the future of food and that we'll all be going to factory-based foods in a few years. It'll be really interesting to see what the acceptability is, but one possibility is that we eat these, like there's no reasons at McDonald's, right, that we couldn't eat these kinds of produced foods, but maybe for specialty items, things that you really care about the provenance and so forth, that you might not eat these sort of factory lab produced foods. Some of you might know who George Monbiot is. He's a author and writer for The Guardian, and his recent book, Regenesis. He talks a lot about this last one, precision fermentation. He visits a factory, I think it was in the Netherlands, and he's convinced that this is the food of the future. All right, so I've talked for a while, and I thought maybe we could have a break. I don't know if there's any questions, any comments, anything to share?
Something just popped in, and Ingrid has put in a couple of links, but there's a long note from Dave Finnegan. Let's see, the green note, talking about his book, I think. So folks can read that comment. Are there any questions?
I have a question. I was once talking about this with a group of teachers, and somebody asked me about the energy use in sort of laboratory generated meat or meat alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And did that, how did that compare, the greenhouse emissions from the energy use, how did that compare to conventional agriculture? And I don't know the answer, so I was wondering, do you know the answer?
I think they are fairly energy intensive.
Mm-hmm.
And also I think it's the cellular based meats that are very water intensive. So, and that's going to be, the water is going to be a problem, right? I mean, these are all technologies. It's conceivable they could reduce the amount of water they need and the amount of energy, but I think they are dependent on how you calculate the energy is going to depend whether we go solar or not, right? Or whether we go renewable or not, right? Mm-hmm. So these assume that we're going to be using renewable energy. And that's where I think they're going to make a big difference.
Yeah, and they also, I mean, apart from climate change and energy use, they reduce cruelty to animals. So, you know, there are other benefits.
Right. But what do you, or what does anybody think? Do you think they will gain consumer acceptance?
Well, I think that the Impossible Burger tastes pretty good to me, and I've been a vegetarian, mostly a vegetarian for 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I have not had a real live cheeseburger in this millennium, but I've had an Impossible Burger, and it's kind of like what I remember for a good hamburger, not for a icky one.
Well, would you eat cellular-based meat? It doesn't kill the animal, but it extracts cells.
Yeah, I would. And most of the reason that I'm vegetarian, well, I'm vegetarian for all the reasons, basically. You know, when people ask me why I'm a vegetarian, I ask them why they eat meat. And so I don't see cruelty as being an issue in growing cells in the lab. So
we had our first Impossible Burgers yesterday at Costco. We had the little tiny portion that they give you at Costco, and my wife and I smacked our lips and said, "This tastes great. How much does it cost?" It was $7 a pound. Well, $7 a pound is much more than you would pay for meat. So it makes no sense. My wife's from the Philippines, and she knows how to cook without meat, and we do. And mostly we eat vegetables that are just vegetables, and it's really good. And tofu, lots of tofu.
Yeah, and tofu done right is very different from tofu done wrong. It's worth noting. And there is a question in the chat. Can you explain a little bit more on what is land use change?
Oh, okay. So land use change is, as I remember correctly, responsible for about 22% of total global emissions, but it's basically taking forest and converting to agriculture is what's relevant here. I mean, it could be converting to commercial or residential uses also. So, but it's just so important because think of all the carbon that's stored in a forest, just in the plant material and the soil. And so this brings up a really interesting issue, is because a lot of people in the climate movement are really looking towards regenerative agriculture and the idea that, you know, if we can have small scale agriculture, organic agriculture, agriculture that you would love to have next door to you, whereas you would never want to have like a CAFO or concentrated animal feed operation with like, 3,000 or 50,000 cows next to you because of the horrible stench and everything else, like the water pollution. But those CAFOs are very efficient at producing meat. So most of this information that I have is from Tim Searchinger, who's at Princeton University and the World Resources Institute. And he strongly believes that we need this industrial agriculture. In his writing, he doesn't say CAFOs in particular, but industrial agriculture in general is just so much more efficient per unit input and what you get out of it, right? So the output per unit input. And so if we have these small operations that are producing lots of protein and calories, then we have to convert less land to growing food for 9 billion people or whatever our population is going to peak at. So this is a huge debate in the climate and, environmental movement. It's kind of share or spare, like regenerative agriculture would be sharing land between agriculture and sort of more natural uses, whereas the spare is you keep the land in the natural, the forested vegetation, and then you spare a smaller amount of land for industrial agriculture. So I hope that answers the question about land use and a little bit more. All right, anything else?
Nothing at the moment.
Okay. Well, we'll move on then. Okay, so I know many of you are educators, some of you are teachers, and this is a graphic of Gen Z's willingness to change habits for the future. So most of you are teaching Gen Zers, and this was a survey. It's actually done by a marketing firm, so they're really, I think, trying to figure out what products they can sell to younger people. But in any case, the question was, if it was proven that the following were more sustainable and beneficial for the planet, how willing would you be to do them? And you really want to look at probably the red bars. The orange are Gen Z's already doing this. The green is that they're willing to do this. So the red is that they're willing or already doing. And you can see that these rate pretty high, right? Over 80% for the first four, which are getting involved in the issues by donating or spreading word via social media, or things like buying upcycled products, switching their vote. But even switching to all proteins in your diet, like insect protein or algae, is still 71% have done it or are willing to do it. So the point I'm trying to make is that Gen Z, the people that you're working with, they want to do something about the environment, about climate, about the planet. So I think they want to learn more than science. And, it'd be fun if we have any questions or comments. Since I'm not a teacher in a classroom where I have a lot of restrictions, I have a lot of freedom in what I teach at Cornell. How do you balance this if you're, for example, a science teacher, but your students really want to do something, and then you have, you have to teach certain content. So I'm really interested in how you all think about this, balancing sort of suggested actions, engaging your students in actions versus teaching the science of climate change. And, I'm sure you've thought about this and there's ways to combine them. Okay, so this is just to reiterate, Generation Z, coming of age in a climate emergency, has made Generation Z unapologetically outspoken and impatient for change. So, sorry about that. So the next part of my talk is about that students can not only take actions themselves, but they can also spread climate behaviors to their friends and family. And so I'm going to talk about what influences the spread of behaviors. Sorry, I'm having a little problem here. Okay, I go up a little. Okay, so what influences the spread of behaviors? And the reason this is so important is because if you, for example, reduce your food waste, or Don is, I forget if you said vegan or vegetarian, but you might feel like, okay, I'm doing something, but the problem is so big, what I'm doing is kind of useless. And so then Don is thinking to himself, well, I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter and I'm going to influence tons of people to follow what I'm doing by posting my really good tofu recipes on Instagram. But is that really going to influence people? How can you scale up your behavior so that you feel like you're doing more than just something all by yourself? It's kind of intermediate by, changing some big policy and just doing individual action. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that influence the spread of behaviors: choice architecture, norms, and social networks. So I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Homer Simpson. When I show this slide, I'm not going to show it anymore in my classes at Cornell because nobody has any idea of whom I'm talking about. They're all so young now, they don't even know who Simpson is. But
It's
you
still
all,
on the air. They're still making new episodes.
well, they don't watch it, Don, I'm telling you. Okay, so you probably remember, Don, that Homer used to like to eat donuts. So did the policeman that he hung out with occasionally. And he would just go into Apu's store and just grab the donuts off the counter, right? But one day Apu thinks to himself, my cunning choice architecture will soon have Homer eating healthy. So you can see here, he has the fresh fruit right there. Homer's not really going to stretch all the way over here to get the donuts, right? He's just going to grab what's easy. So that's choice architecture. That's changing the environment or the physical setting to make something easier to do, or to make the right option, the one we want people to do, the default option, or at least the easy option. And this is from a book by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein called Nudge. Okay, so this is an example of choice architecture that I experienced. I used to give, before COVID, workshops in China, and they were environmental ed workshops. And this was a workshop that we did at Hangzhou Botanic Gardens. And we would do the workshop and then we'd break for lunch. And the first day of this workshop, our lunch looked like what was on the left here. And we made piles and piles of trash. It was really kind of shocking. And so I kind of complained to my hosts. And then the next day, they brought me a reusable plate. And we went over to the Hangzhou Botanic Gardens canteen or cafeteria. And it was for the workers, but everybody there had to bring their own plate and silverware or chopsticks, or else you wouldn't get served. And then they had this area here where you could wash your dishes. And back in the back here, you can't really see it, but they had a thing that sterilized the dishes. So basically, they had created a choice architecture or a physical setting where people would bring their own reusable dishes and use them instead of giving out one-time use plastics. Is anybody from, Don, are you or Dave, are you familiar, or Ingrid, those are the people I can see, and Patricia, are you familiar with the Climate Action Now app?
I downloaded it today while I was reading the book.
Oh, okay. You must have been really bored with the book, Don.
What'd you say?
I guess you were bored with the book.
Yeah, no. I was motivated by the book.
Okay. Patricia, yeah, do you know the Climate Action Now app?
No.
Oh. Okay, so this is an app. As Don can tell you, you can download it for iPhone or Android. It's free. And basically, I'm involved with the app. I'm a volunteer content creators, and I also have my students at Cornell do independent studies or class projects, and they create content. So the content, this one is things like this. It's like a letter that we have written. If you were downloaded the app, you would go through you could scroll through like hundreds of letters like this. And there's other things on the app too. There's little quizzes you can take. There's links to articles and videos. And some of what we call the ask tell, which is this kind of an action, writing a letter to somebody. Most of them are for state or federal representatives. This one happens to be to a business. And they're just really short letters that ask people to support a particular policy or practice. because you put in your zip code when you download the app and register, if this were one, say, tell my representative to support a date labeling bill in Congress, then it would automatically, for me, go to Mark Molinaro. And then if I wanted to tell my senators to do that, then it would automatically go to Gillibrand and Schumer. So it's based on your zip code. You don't have to you don't have to have any address or fill out a form online. You just click, you want to send this to your representative or your senator. And it also, we can do it at the state level, your assembly person or your state senator, and it goes automatically to them. So you can, on the app, edit the letters, but most people don't, right? Because it's hard, well, at least for old people like me, it's hard to type on the phone. So this is a sort of quantity, maybe over quality. I'm not saying the letters are low quality, but they're not individualized to you very much. So, a lot of people say, well, so many letters, they keep getting letters that are just look like the same. On the other hand, they're getting a lot of letters. So I think of it as balancing quantity versus quality. And I can say that the app, we do a lot of what we call action parties. We have one tomorrow. It's just for New York State. It's something kind of random, not really related to climate, but it's on community garden legislation in New York State. And then there's one, I think next week on plastics. But what an action party is, we'll have a speaker, an outside speaker. Tomorrow's speakers from National Resources Defense Council, and then we're going to have a couple others. And they talk for about a half hour. And then you use a QR code to go into what's called a campaign on the app. But basically, it's queued up a bunch of actions related to the speaker topic. So tomorrow there will be actions. We'll be sending letters to the state assembly and state senate about a bill that supports community gardens. They're a lot of fun because you're kind of like, say, can you imagine if you were listening to me now and you got a little bored? All you'd have to do was, you can just be working on your phone at the same time you're listening to me and sending actions, sending letters to Congress or state assembly that says to support policies that I'm talking about. What's the action there, Don?
I emailed my congressman this afternoon to push for the debt ceiling stuff.
Oh, very timely.
The exact phrasing, and it was easy to edit the email actually that I sent. I did personalize it.
Okay, so that's because you're better on typing on the phone than I am. And I actually, speaking of food, because that's kind of what I'm emphasizing here, I created about 150 letters. A few of them are quizzes or links to an article, but most of them are letters about the Farm Bill, which is being revised for the next 5 years this year, and things about food waste and research on enteric emissions and so forth. So you'll find a lot of farm-related and food-related actions. You can work on those next on. Okay, so just in terms of choice architecture, sorry, I got off on a little tangent, but the whole point is that app makes it very easy to send letters to your representatives. And also you can influence choice architecture. I didn't give a lot of examples here, but by in your refrigerator, putting the old food in front, for example, so it doesn't get lost in the back, then members of your family or those who are living with you are more likely to not waste food. Things, of course, they've done a lot of experiments with choice architecture and eating, with placing in a cafeteria line the more healthy options in the front of the line, so people are more likely to choose them. All right, any other comments? I know I've been giving Don a hard time. Does anybody have any other comments on choice architecture or questions?
There is a little bit in the chat. For one thing, working on getting high-speed chargers, which I will note as someone who telecommutes to Ithaca and gets there about once a month. The high-speed charging infrastructure in Ithaca is unbelievably bad. Which is discussed in the book somewhat, but I'd love to see that get better. And a couple of people downloaded the app, and there's a note that I sent many emails for many senators in Joe Biden's office and got the response to them and found them most useful. So
Great.
good.
So yeah, the e-vehicles infrastructure is a good example of choice architecture. It's not so easy to drive an e-vehicle right now, is what you're saying, Don. But that's going to change soon.
Yeah, it's getting easier every day. I've had mine for 2 years, pretty much to the day. I think I got it in the middle of May 2 years ago, and I put 30,000 miles on it. So it's not that hard to get around, but Ithaca is actually one of the more challenging places to go because there's hardly any high-speed chargers in the city of Ithaca, which it kind of mystifies me given Ithaca's reputation.
I concur.
Of course, the people who live in Ithaca charge in their garage. It's only irritating for the visitors that there's not high-speed charging.
Somebody started to unmute themselves.
That was me, and I was just concurring with Don. We were just in Ithaca this past week, and Don's right. We were just visiting for a couple of days, and it is not the easiest place to charge your Bolt.
All right. Okay, so we're going to move on to norms now. Thank you. So norms, there's a bunch of different kinds of norms, but descriptive norms are what other people do. So they're very effective in messaging and trying to change behavior if the majority of people do a certain action. So as an example, 75% of Americans express concern about the climate. Most elders volunteer for an organization, or 9 out of 10 Democrats contribute money to an environmental organization. So the idea here is if I see that most other people are doing these actions, I'll want to do those actions too. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this towel experiment in hotels. So I'll just go over it really quickly. The experiment was to try and get people in hotels, visitors to hotels, to reuse their towels instead of throw them on the floor where the maids would come and pick them up. So they had 2 messages. The first was join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment. Almost 75% of guests who are asked to participate reuse their towels. And you can see that the emphasis here was on joining your fellow guests and that most of them are doing this. The second message focused on the environment, help save the environment. And so which message, A and B, resulted in more people reusing their towels? Does anybody want to write in the chat? Is everybody familiar with this? I'm assuming most people are. You weren't, Ingrid? Because that's good if not everybody is familiar with this study. It's pretty famous, so I'm glad that it's new for somebody. Anybody write anything in the chat? I can actually see the chat too.
Yeah, there's lots of everybody saying A.
Okay, so even Ingrid wasn't familiar with it. Ingrid still got the right answer. Congratulations.
She's pretty smart.
She's pretty smart. That's why she's working at PRI. Okay. But what if most people do not do those desired behaviors? So I can't tell you that most people are vegans or most people write letters supporting climate policy. So what do I do then? So there's been some recent work on dynamic or trending norms. And here the idea is that you talk about how a behavior is increasing. So instead of saying that only 6% of people are vegan, you say the number of US consumers identifying as vegan grew from 1% to 6% between 2014 and 2017, a 600% increase. So you try to convince people that this is what's happening, this is a trend, and then they'll want to join it. And there was an experiment performed in the Stanford cafeteria about dynamic norms. So the first norm is static, and it says, okay, so the experiment is these students go through the cafeteria line, and then they give them a message, one of 2 messages while they're in the line, a static or a dynamic norm message. And then what they measure is how many students order meals without meat. So the static norm message is some people limit how much meat they eat. Recent research has shown that about 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat. The dynamic norm message is some people are starting to limit how much meat they eat. This is true both nationally and here at Stanford. Specifically, recent research has shown that over the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit their meat. So you get the idea. This is how many people, what percent of people are limiting their meat, or this is how much the population has increased, or the number of people, the percent of people who are limiting their meat has increased. Static or dynamic? Okay, A or B in the chat. Dave says B, Stephen says B. Okay, Karen says A. Everybody, Jane and Barbara say B. Okay, so here we have the results. So this is participants on the y-axis who ordered a meatless lunch. You can see that the control is 20%. One of the conditions is actually less than 20%, and one of them is greater than 20%. So the higher it is, the better the result, or the more effective the norm message. So it's actually dynamic norm message, which was B. And you can see that over 30% of the students in this cafeteria line who received a dynamic norm message, who received a message that more and more people are not eating meat, had a higher or ordered fewer meat meals, more meatless lunches than those who received the message that 30%, the static norm, are trying to reduce meat consumption, but didn't say anything about that more and more people are trying to reduce meat consumption. All right, so norms. Descriptive and dynamic norms both influence behavior. You can use dynamic norms when the behavior is not prevalent, but it is increasing. And you can use norm messages with family and friends. So any comments, questions, suggestions, observations?
Yeah, not being shy. I'll say in our school programs, which are elementary and middle school, we put a big chart up on the wall out in the hallway, and the kids can put up a Post-it note every time they do anything that's in our Green Actioneers Family Action Guide.
Mm-hmm.
And the other kids come out there and look at it and they go, oh my God, I can put up another Post-it note. Susie put up 5, I can put up 6. So we're using a choice architecture, which is those Post-it notes up on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And they're under different categories like saving energy, changing diet, and so forth. And the elementary and middle school kids really get behind it. And they love to put up the Post-it notes. And so that changes the norms for everybody, because everybody then wants to become like Susie or like Bobby or like Timmy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they all put up more Post-it notes. They go home, they say, Mom, we got to do one more thing. And so we have 100 different things that they can do in the book. We think of the book like Drawdown for families. And so each family can choose the things that they want to do in order to get as close to 0 as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thanks, Dave. I'm kind of wondering to myself, is that choice architecture? It feels more like peer pressure or spreading behaviors between those who you know. I'm assuming the students in the school know each other. But it's a really interesting use of sort of trying to spread behaviors among people who know each other, which is actually what I was going to talk about next. And it's also sending a norm message as more and more people are doing this behavior, maybe a dynamic norm message. So thank you. Anybody else?
There are a couple of comments in the chat, but they're sort of off the topic of dynamic norms and descriptive norms.
Okay, but there's some people going back to the dairy thing, it looks like.
Yeah.
So are they involved in methane, the dairy industry in New York? I know that, well, that at least Cornell, we're doing some experiments. We have one of those methane chambers, like I showed earlier, to measure the cow emissions. And I'm actually not sure how much they're collaborating with farmers yet on these, but dairy is aware that they need to do things. And so I went to a hearing on the Farm Bill, and the G.T. Thompson, he's the chair of the House Ag Committee. He's a representative from Northern Pennsylvania, so he's very conservative, central Northern Pennsylvania. He's a Republican. And they had Langworthy there, who's from the kind of just west of where we are in Ithaca, all the way over to Jamestown. So big swath of rural southern tier New York. And then also my representative, Mark Molinari. So, and there was another guy from Wisconsin. 4 Republican representatives were there. And well, first thing, this has to do with that land use question, because G.T. Thompson, the chair of the committee, in his remarks, he said that agriculture is actually a net sequesterer of carbon. And I had never heard this before, so I asked his staff where he got the figure, and they sent me the publication. It's actually the IPC report, but what he failed to say is that agriculture and forestry are net sequesterer of carbon. So agriculture is a net emitter of carbon, but when you add in forestry, then the net, I don't know, it might be about equal or something like that. So I thought he was quite misleading, but I did kind of corner him afterwards, G.T. Thompson, and I also talked to a farmer who was sitting next to me, and I asked him, were they open to these kinds of emissions, reducing methane emissions type practices? And they are open if it's research. So Thompson is a big supporter of research and extension. Of course, the thing was run by Cornell, so he was trying to talk up cooperative extension in Cornell. But he really did seem to think that it was possible to get in the Farm Bill and have policies that would encourage this research on feed additives. And the farmer was also very, I wouldn't say very, but she was open to it as long as she was paid, because she wasn't going to lose money. I'm sure she wasn't making a lot of money. She was a dairy farmer in Dutchess County over Hudson Valley area. And so she wanted to have, government support if she was going to try these different experiments to make sure she could at least break even. But they're aware that methane is important, and that if they don't address it, it's only going to grow in importance as percentage of US emissions, because everything else, like Don was saying, right, electricity emissions are going down. I think transportation emissions are going to go down as people start buying EVs, and agricultural emissions, even if they stay stable, they'll go up as a percentage. And so they're just going to be, sort of looked at more and more. And so I think they're interested in reducing emissions, but they have to, have the money behind that.
Yeah, I do know a few years ago, anyway, there was a pretty large dairy operation somewhere in Genesee County, which is Batavia, Western New York, that had a fairly large methane digester for capturing the methane from the manure, but I don't know any real details about it, and I don't know if it's still going on. I think it was in partnership with Cornell, though. I'm pretty
Probably.
sure.
So there's a lot of controversy about these methane digesters, because there has been support from New York State, but it's the big producers, right? The ones that have several thousand cows or so. And it's only financially feasible if you're a big producer. And they do it a lot in California, these big dairy operations, and people are worried now that the energy produced is going to become more valuable than the milk produced. And so farmers are going to keep increasing their operations because they're getting support from the state or from the feds to do these biodigesters. There's also a lot of leakage, like people like Bob Howarth at Cornell, who does a lot of research on methane, really concerned about the leakage from these biodigesters. So my impression from working with several climate volunteer organizations is that the climate people are not in favor of them. These big ones, there's too many problems with them right now. So
yeah, there are home scale biodigesters.
Yes.
I don't know enough about them to say anything intelligent.
Yeah, I don't think there's state support. I don't think they think they're going to make enough difference to, they're not going to go into the grid. So there hasn't been a lot of focus on them. All right. So we're going to go, let's see how we're doing for time. We have time still. We're going to go.
Also a question about influencing packaging decisions for manufacturers. So I don't know if you know, that is kind of off your narrative flow. So you might want to come back to that later.
Yeah, I can't think of any comments on that right now.
Okay.
It's not something that I've worked on a lot or worked on at all, really. And I don't even know if these new sort of cardboardy takeout containers that people are using, do they have a film on them that makes them not so that they're going to resist water absorption or oil absorption? But I'm wondering if that also means that they're using forever plastics and they're not really compostable. I don't know if
Yeah,
anybody
I think
knows.
unless you've got, my ex-wife actually works in large scale composting, and unless you've got large scale compost facilities, an awful lot of things that are labeled as compostable are not really compostable,
Mhm.
and mostly end up in landfills.
All right. Oh, we already had our little discussion of norms. Here's the idea that we're going to be influenced how much we contribute to the street musician by what everybody around us is contributing. All right. So we talked about norms and what we can do if the behavior is in the majority, if it's not in the majority, but it's a trending behavior. But what if the behavior is not the majority and not trending? So this is from the Pew Research Group, and they're looking at what climate actions people are taking this is from 2021, so it'd be interesting to know what the current figures are. But in any case, you can see that 16% of people donated money to an organization focused on climate change, 10% contacted an elected official. Hopefully that's going to go way up. It's going to become a trending norm because of Climate Action Now app. 10% volunteered for an activity focused on addressing climate change, and 6% attended a protest or a rally. So 24%, about a quarter of people had done one of these activities. I don't think it's bad, but it's not the majority. And you can see here it's broken down by age. So again, Gen Z, they're doing more of these activities than are people like me. I'm a boomer. So that's good if you're teaching. And if you're a boomer, then we need to step up our game. Okay. Here's another interesting thing we can think about, because these behaviors are not in the majority and we're not sure if they're trending, is that more younger adults say they've been encouraged by family or friends to do something on climate change. So here's a percent of US adults who say a friend or family member has ever personally encouraged them to get more involved in efforts to reduce the effects of climate change. So Gen Z, again, is highest at about 36%, and criticize them. It's over on the right. The important thing here is that that phrase that I have circled in red, family or friends, are influencing others. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this happens through looking at social networks. So here's 3 social networks, 3 diagrams. Think of each round circle. Let's go on the left, this regular network, as being a person, and the line, whether it's a curved line like this or a more straight line like this, as being a tire connection. So that what that means is that if you're the person I have my arrow on, that you're communicating with or doing something with this person that you have a line connecting you with, and also this person, because you're also connected with that person, and the same on the other side. Now, a small world network, you can see that one of these connections to somebody that's situated close to you has been replaced by, let's just call this somebody on the other side of town. So you're connected, I'm connected to Don, who lives in Buffalo, and I've replaced that connection with, say, somebody who's my next door neighbor who I don't know very well. And then random is just a mixture of connections, close connections, and these weaker connections. Okay, so just to think about this in a little bit more detail. I'm this red person here. In this regular network, I'm connected to the person right next to me, as well as to the person that's one step away from me. Same on the other side. The important thing here is that this person here next to me is also connected to somebody I'm connected to on the other side. So many of my friends, this person and this person, are also friends themselves. So this is really important when you think about messaging. In the small world network, as I mentioned, that this connection has been replaced by one with somebody who's farther away, and I probably have a weaker connection with them than I do with this person right next to me. Okay, again, the random network has only weak ties. Well, mostly weak ties. There might be a couple close ties. The small world has close and weak ties, and the regular network has close ties. So by close ties, it means I'm seeing this person often, I'm doing things with them often, or communicating with them often. Okay, so do you think that behaviors like climate behaviors, like let's just say changing your diet, reducing food waste, writing to your representative to support a climate policy, spread faster in close tie or weak tie networks? So again, put close tie or weak tie in the chat. We'll just wait for a couple people to do that.
First two responses are both close.
All right.
First three.
Okay. Well, I need to.
So we know from epidemiology.
This is the work, the person speaking here is Damon Santola, who works on different kinds of networks and behavior spread, and he's at the University of Pennsylvania. So he does a little simulation of behavior spread through these different networks.
Embedded people in social networks. You can see here the left-hand side has a kind of residential structured network, and the right-hand side has a casual contact network. And then we seeded them with behaviors and watched them spread. We're going to watch these spread simultaneously, and what you see is that in the residential networks, people are adopting in these neighborhoods, and then there's a spillover effect where the behavior spreads to the next neighborhood, and so forth. In the casual contact network, you can see it sort of spreads all over the network, but it spreads more slowly. And in fact, at the end of this process, you get many more adopters in the residential network than in the casual contact network. Now this is striking and really surprising. So it means is that behavior spread really differently than disease does. So the intuitions from epidemiology about diffusion dynamics don't generalize. But of course, for practical applications, what this means is when you design a health policy intervention, for example, you get people in Southern Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So we know from epidemiology that the pattern who's connected to whom.
Sorry about this.
So
I always have oh, I know what it is. There we go. Okay, so those who said close tie were right. And this is super important one, because it's a little counterintuitive for many people, because you think, okay, behaviors are going to spread like disease spread. You may remember a few years ago, there was a measles outbreak at Disney World, right? These were weak tie networks. These are people that just happened to be at Disney World at the same time, or I think it was Disneyland. It was in Los Angeles. And they got measles, and there was another outbreak at the Minneapolis airport. Very weak tie, random networks. But behaviors spread through close tie networks. And so that's why Don or Ingrid or Jane or me or Dave, we're probably, we're not influencers. Even influencers maybe aren't going to impact these more complex behaviors like changing your diet. They might tell you to go buy a Gucci handbook or purse or whatever. But we are, at least most of us, I know I'm not an influencer. So my best opportunity to influence people is in these close tie networks, in my family and friends. And it's probably the same for most of us. So just another way to think about this. The person whose behavior we're trying to change is this person in the middle that the arrow is pointing to. And we have one person who's sending a message to change your behavior, but the person doesn't change their behavior, the person in the middle. Now we have two messengers, still no change. Now we have three messengers, and the person's changed their behavior. So it often takes multiple messengers sending multiple messages in order for us to change complex behaviors, like what we eat or what we do with food waste or to buy an EV, et cetera. And the lessons learned are multiple messages from multiple messengers are needed to change complex behaviors. Complex behaviors spread more rapidly in close tie networks like family and friends, and you can influence your close networks. So any questions, discussion, chat, comments?
Questions, comments?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I wonder whether Cornell, my alma mater, your department maybe, would be interested in finding out what does happen in a school when the entire school gets a copy of the Green Actioneers Family Action Guide, and how many families actually take action, and what actions they take, and what impact those actions would have, and how they made the decisions to take those actions. So those are the questions that I have now as the author of the book. The book is about to come out, and I'd love to have a school, and there are many schools that are going to be adopting the book, have a school step forward to volunteer to be that school where the research got done, and then to have someone like your own department say, well, we want to do that research. We want to find out whether it was norms or whether it was whatever the limiting factors and the causal factors were to make people either do something or not do something. So let's correspond about that, or if there's anybody else at any other university who would like to take that on as a challenge, because I'm not content to just doing a few schools. I want to do this nationwide and start a movement among elementary and middle school kids and their parents to go green.
Okay, well, thanks, Dave. It's a great invitation. Appreciate it, and appreciate all the work you're doing. All right, anything else? All right, shall we move on? We have one last section of the talk. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about is network climate action, and that's applying these ideas about behavior spreading through close social networks. So network climate action is very simple. I talk about it in the book. It's just taking an effective action yourself. And you all know already, you're familiar with Drawdown, so you know what some of these effective actions are, and we've talked about them. And then it's applying research to influence others to take that action alongside you. We already talked about Drawdown, so you can choose some actions. I actually did a network climate action, and it wasn't really one of the top ones, but I still think it's pretty important. And that was, I tried to get people in my department to voluntarily pay for carbon offsets for work travel. So that's the action that I chose, carbon offsets. And my network was my faculty colleagues. I, along the way, added my family and friends, because it turned out my faculty colleagues, even though we're in Department of Natural Resources and the Environment, weren't that open to the idea. So I tried to do a little bit of work with dynamic norms and spark my group with some people I knew, so that I could say more and more people are buying travel offsets. So there's a little bit of choice architecture in here. I use the Finger Lakes Climate Fund. You don't have to be in the Finger Lakes to go onto this site or even to join the Finger Lakes Climate Fund. And what this does is it makes it really easy to contribute money to pay for any kind of travel offsets or even your building energy offsets. And there's a lot of sites that, allow you to pay for offsets. But what I really like about the Finger Lakes Climate Fund is that the money goes to low-income families in our region of upstate New York and the Finger Lakes to weatherize their homes. And I found when I was doing this with my colleagues in my department, some of them really liked the idea of where the money was going. This isn't an approved certified offsets program. Like if you buy some offsets through Delta Airlines or something, it may be certified by a global body, but it's kind of nice to know that it's going to help alleviate some issues with poverty amongst those people in your neighborhood. So there's kind of a social, pull to donating to the Finger Lakes Climate Fund. And they have teams. So you have this Carbon Races leaderboard. And this was a while back. We were number 5. My team was called Furno and Friends because I work in Furno Hall. Originally, it was just called the Furno team, but then I had to add friends. So because I was really doing a lot, like going and knocking on the door of my colleagues in the office and trying to convince them to donate to Finger Lakes Climate Fund, and some did, but I wasn't getting a great response. So I enlisted my family members, my friends. Sometimes I even paid for their offsets just to get them here on our team so that I could send those dynamic norm messages and say more and more people are now contributing to the climate fund and offsetting their travel. So that's just an example. I would say I had mixed success. I then stopped because the COVID pandemic came along, and I haven't really done a lot other than I contribute myself since then. It's really difficult to talk to people about these kinds of things. So there's this great paper which talks about moral rebels. So we're all moral rebels. We're trying to do something about climate. We believe it's the morally right thing to do. And this paper talks about communication strategies if you are a moral rebel. And there's 3 main points here. Talk about actions, not character. So don't challenge them about who they are as a person. Avoid judging them. But if they do, and this I'm going to the 3rd one, take any positive action or movements in the climate friendly direction, then commend them, give them praise, when they try out something like meatless Mondays rather than condemning them for eating meat on Tuesday. And then talk about behaviors that you and by implication others can change. And this includes sharing a personal journey of how you changed a behavior, including any struggles along the way and ongoing challenges. So avoid using absolutist or morally laden labels like meat eater versus vegan. So, and this one actually is the one in the middle really works well for me because I try to be vegan, but since I have other people that I'm living with who aren't vegan, you know, if they're gonna, for Mother's Day, they got me a cheesecake. And I wasn't going to tell them I'm not going to eat this cheesecake because I'm vegan. So I will occasionally eat dairy and meat. I also help my mother-in-law prepare her meals, and she buys tons of food, and then, you know, it's all going bad in her refrigerator. So I'll steal some of her moldy cheese, cut off the mold and eat it. It's because I think it's better to eat dairy than it is to waste it and send it to the landfill or even to my compost pile. So, you know, I'm not an absolutist, and I think that might help in communicating with people because I don't feel as judged. But if you are an absolutist, that's great also, but you might think of some other communication strategies. All right. I just wanted to say that some of my students at Cornell, they have tried these network climate actions. And the important point here is it doesn't just have to be a lifestyle action like eating less meat. It can be a policy action. So the Seattle Transport Plan, I had a student from Seattle, and she tried to get her family and high school friends back home to support this Seattle Transport Plan, and that was her network climate action. I've also had a number of students raise money for FOM International. It's a really cool organization that provides menstrual supplies for girls in developing countries. So these are girls, if they can't get menstrual supplies and they probably don't have enough money to buy them, they're going to drop out of school due to the embarrassment, and they'll probably never enter the workforce. So this kind of relates to women's health and education and providing an opportunity for women to decide family size. I had a student that worked with her sorority, for example, to make for her network climate action to make FOM International the target of their fundraising effort for that semester. And then up here on the upper right, I have a student from China. His name is Tim. And he decided to work with his family in Shenzhen, China on food waste. And he discovered that they were wasting about almost half of their food each week. And the reason was very simple. His father would often stop on the way home and eat out with colleagues, but his mom prepared food for his dad every day anyways. So he got his parents to communicate. His dad would text his mom, send her a WeChat message that he was stopping by to eat dinner with his friends, with his colleagues. And then she didn't prepare a meal for him that night. And they got their food waste down to nearly zero. And most of my students choose plant-rich diet. And they really have fun with it because they can invite their friends over or do it at their fraternity or sorority or, you know, their housemates. I had a vegan student who played baseball for Cornell, and he did it with his teammates. And they really enjoy cooking new types of meals and then having friends over, and they talk about how it's a class project and the importance of eating less meat. And then sometimes they find that when they get invited over to a friend's house, that they're also served meatless meals. So you can try all different kinds of network climate actions. You can do it with family and friends, and you can have fun along the way. All right, so the lessons learned: climate behavior spread among family and friends. Network climate action involves applying research and can speed up the process of these actions spreading. Oops, I don't know why I always have problems with this. Okay, there we are. And that you can do policy, donation, and lifestyle actions. Donation, like to fund international policy, supporting a particular policy like the Seattle transportation policy. And lifestyle actions are really the most popular, like reducing food waste and reducing meat consumption. All right, so I wanted to thank you all, and just to remind you that those of you who are educators are working with a generation who really cares about this stuff. So I think it's up to us to explore ways that we can incorporate this into the classroom. I don't know the answers because I'm working in a university classroom. It's a little different than a K through 12 classroom, but I'd love to hear from you about how you think we can give students an opportunity to take either lifestyle or policy or donation actions. And if you would like a copy of my book, you can scan that or just enter the 09B card code on the Cornell University Press website. So thank you. And I think we're good for time. We have
Yeah, we got
about 8 minutes for any discussions or anything you all want to share with me about the feasibility. I'd love to hear from people about whether these ideas are able to be implemented in schools and in different grades, whether it's just not feasible. If you have any suggestions for me and others.
So I'm not sure what percentage of the folks on the call are classroom K-12 teachers, but I know personally a couple of them, so I know there are some. Anybody want to chime in on that? And actually sort of free associating a little bit, right before this meeting, I got a request for sort of secondhand from a reporter looking for teachers, K-12 teachers who are teaching about climate change right now. And if you're one of those, shoot me a note. And I might get you in touch with somebody from NPR to talk about that. But if you want to talk about it now, we can talk about it now too.
I want to talk about it because that's what I do. I work in elementary and middle schools. I've been in over 2,000 schools personally with a previous program, which was teaching juggling. And it was a lot of fun. And I did that for 30 years. And then I quit because the internet came along and people could learn how to juggle without me. But what I did was I invented a way of teaching juggling with nylon scarves in slow motion. So I took that program, replicated the flow of the day, and created a program about climate change. I took Al Gore's third training course in January 2007, and then I designed a program called Climate Change is Elementary. And I delivered that in schools in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Colorado. I couldn't deliver it here in Florida where I live. And the reason was because it had climate change in the title. And because we talked about global warming and sea level rise. So that's the big bugaboo. 85% of teachers want to teach about climate change, only 45% do. And the reason they don't do it is because A, it's not in the curriculum, and B, they're going to get poked in the chest by some dad who's going to come in and go, you know what you're telling my kids. So that's why when we designed the Green Actioneers Family Action Guide, we designed a book that does not talk about climate change, global warming, or sea level rise. It talks about going green. And so the big bugaboo is that there are a lot of parents out there that don't want to hear this, that are running around with their hands over their ears going, don't tell me this climate change stuff. So instead, we talk about going green. And if a dad's a hunter, he wants more game to shoot. If he's a fisherman, he wants to be able to eat his catch. If he's a farmer, he wants clean soil. If he works outside under the sun, he wants more shade. So we think we've licked that. And so what we need to do is find out whether we've licked that or not with our program. And the program involves every family in the school. It's not just a kid or two buys the book. It's like Scholastic Books book fair with one book. So I'd love to have anybody on the call or anybody you know get in touch with me about doing the definitive research about whether this is working or not.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure if there's anybody else that they have a chance also.
I will note, I meant to say this in the introduction, that I've read the book and enjoyed it, and am amazed by how many different initiatives Marianne has tried herself, and how many of her students, there are great stories of things that her students are up to, and I highly recommend the book. So, and you've got right there a code to save 30%. So.
Thanks for the promotion, Don. Yeah, I think the book, a lot of it is my thoughts about individual action and how it can be more meaningful. So that's why I talk about network climate action, but I also talk a lot about finding volunteer opportunities that worked for me in the climate movement, ones that where I felt like I could use my skills and be happy, because I think to sustain a volunteer activity, you have to find one that fits for you. So
yeah, and I think you talked about that nicely, sort of figuring out how to find your niche.
Mm-hmm.
And Ingrid's got a hand up.
And Marianne, what do you think about Catherine Hayhoe's statement that the most important thing we can do about climate change is to talk about it, and how that's related to, you know, what you just talked about influencing behavior?
Well, I'm sorry, I really haven't read her books, so I don't know the context, and I know that she does amazing work, is an amazing person. But I would not agree with that statement out of context, because I think, okay, so there's some other work done by Robert H. Frank at Cornell. He has a book called Under the Influence, and they've done research on solar panel installation and how it occurs in neighborhoods. So if I see a solar panel on my neighbor's house, I'm more likely to put one on my house. So again, it's these social networks and how we influence each other. So that's why I think behaviors are so important. And it doesn't happen immediately. Like my family has been hearing, you know, seeing me do this and talk about these things like reducing meat consumption for years, and they're starting to do it now, my kids. And so I think, you know, trying to change norms, demonstrate behaviors. I mean, people copy behaviors. That's why we all, not we maybe on this call, but Robert Frank also talks about affluencers. Like, why does everybody have to have the bigger destination wedding or the bigger McMansion and everything? Because we see our neighbors doing it and we want to keep up with them. It becomes the norm. So we can do the same thing with our climate behaviors. That's my take on it. But again, I should read her, and I think she has probably a lot more to say than that quote.
So maybe one of our takeaways is walking the talk.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Jane. Good to see you.
Hi, it's really a pleasure to be here. I have a confession. I tried to order the book through Cornell University Press, and I must have just glitched or something. But I would let people know you really can get it through Amazon if by some chance University Cornell filling out the forms, it just did not like me.
Okay. Yeah, it's obviously a lot easier to order through Amazon. You don't get the discount through Amazon, but the book isn't very expensive. And
I was
also,
going to say, I wanted the book.
they recorded it in audio, and you can get that on Amazon too, but not on the Cornell Press site because it's a different publisher when they do an audio book. And there's an ebook which is available on Amazon and on Cornell University Press. So you can get it in different formats.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we're about 8:30, Don. I don't want to keep people past their bedtime. My bedtime's
Okay.
8 o'clock, so.
Yeah, and I will remind folks that we've got another session tomorrow at 5:30 talking about the climate literacy principles, and we'd love to have you join us. The registration link is there, and if you want to email me about any questions on anything at all, here's my email address. And tonight's talk we live streamed on YouTube, so it'll be up on PRI's YouTube channel, which is just our website, followed by /YouTube. Let me put that in http:// right. And thanks to Marianne for doing this with us tonight. And I thought it was great, and I recommend the book. I guess maybe we're done. Any other last questions?
Well, thank you, Don. And
Thank
yes,
you.
thanks everybody else from PRI and everybody else that came on tonight. And yeah, feel free to send me an email if you want to discuss further. So it's been fun.
It has. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Have a good night all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.